Sarah Martinez had always believed that photography was about capturing moments that already existed. She never imagined her camera would show her things that shouldn't be there at all. The 28-year-old freelance photographer lived in a small apartment in Portland, Oregon, where she spent most of her time editing wedding photos and taking portraits for local families. Her life was ordinary, predictable, and exactly the way she liked it. On a foggy Tuesday morning in October, Sarah received an unusual call from Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, an elderly woman who lived in the historic Riverside district. Mrs. Whitman wanted someone to photograph her Victorian house before she sold it. The house had been in her family for over a century, and she wanted professional photos for both the real estate listing and her personal collection of memories. Sarah agreed to the job, though something in Mrs. Whitman's voice seemed nervous, almost hesitant. When she asked about scheduling, the elderly woman insisted that Sarah come during daylight hours only. She mentioned that the house had quirks that were better handled in natural light. Sarah didn't think much of it at the time. Old houses often had poor lighting, and many elderly clients preferred daytime appointments. The Whitman house stood at the end of Maple Street, surrounded by tall oak trees that had grown wild over the decades. The Victorian architecture was stunning, with intricate woodwork and stained glass windows that caught the morning light beautifully. Sarah felt excited about the project as she pulled her equipment from her car. The house would photograph magnificently, and she could already envision the dramatic shots she would capture. Mrs. Whitman greeted her at the front door, a petite woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple blue cardigan and had kind eyes that seemed to hold secrets. As she led Sarah through the house, she pointed out specific rooms and angles she wanted photographed. The interior was filled with antique furniture, family portraits, and delicate lace curtains that filtered the sunlight into soft, dreamy beams. Sarah began her work in the living room, adjusting her camera settings to accommodate the mix of natural and artificial light. The room was beautiful, with a grand piano in one corner and built-in bookshelves that reached the ceiling. She took several shots, checking each one on her camera's display screen. Everything looked normal and exactly as she expected. Moving to the dining room, Sarah noticed that Mrs. Whitman seemed to hover nearby, watching her work with an intensity that felt unusual. Most clients either left photographers alone or chatted casually while they worked. Mrs. Whitman was different. She observed every shot Sarah took, and occasionally glanced toward certain areas of the room as if she was looking for something specific. The dining room featured a large mahogany table surrounded by chairs that had been crafted in the early 1900s. A crystal chandelier hung overhead, casting rainbow patterns on the walls when the sunlight hit it just right. Sarah positioned herself to capture the interplay of light and shadow, taking multiple shots from different angles. As she worked, she felt increasingly aware of the house's silence. It was the kind of quiet that seemed too complete, as if the building itself was holding its breath. After finishing the main floor, Mrs. Whitman led Sarah upstairs to photograph the bedrooms. The wooden steps creaked under their feet, and Sarah noticed that many of the family portraits lining the stairway walls showed people from different eras. Some photos appeared to be from the 1800s, while others looked more recent. The faces in the pictures seemed to follow her as she climbed, though she knew this was just a common optical illusion with old photographs. The master bedroom was particularly striking. With a 4-poster bed and windows that overlooked the back garden, Sarah spent considerable time capturing the room's vintage charm, focusing on details like the antique vanity table and the way afternoon light streamed through the lace curtains. Mrs. Whitman stood in the doorway during this part of the shoot, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. As Sarah worked, she began to notice something odd about her camera's behavior. Occasionally, the autofocus would hunt frantically, as if it was trying to focus on something that wasn't there. She assumed it was having trouble with the mixed lighting conditions or possibly malfunctioning. Photography equipment could be temperamental, especially in older buildings, with unusual electromagnetic fields from old wiring. The final room on her list was a small study at the end of the hallway. Mrs. Whitman had mentioned that this room held special significance for the family, as it had been her late husband's workspace for 40 years. The room contained a desk covered with old papers, a leather chair worn smooth from decades of use, and shelves lined with books and family mementos. As Sarah raised her camera to capture the study, she felt a sudden chill run through the room. The temperature seemed to drop noticeably, and she noticed that Mrs. Whitman had stepped back into the hallway. Sarah attributed the cold to drafts common in old houses and continued working. She took several shots of the desk area, the bookshelf, and the window that looked out onto the street. When she finished photographing the interior, Sarah suggested taking some exterior shots to complete the portfolio. Mrs. Whitman agreed, but mentioned that she needed to leave for a doctor's appointment. She gave Sarah permission to continue working outside and asked her to lock the front door when she finished. Before leaving, Mrs. Whitman paused at her car and turned back toward Sarah. "If you notice anything unusual in your photos," she said quietly, "please call me right away. Don't dismiss it as a mistake or a problem with your equipment." Sarah found the comment strange but nodded politely. She spent another hour photographing the house's exterior, capturing the architectural details and the way the building nestled among the mature trees. The work went smoothly, and she felt satisfied with the variety of shots she had captured. As she packed her equipment, Sarah felt pleased with the day's work. The Whitman house had been a perfect subject, and she was confident that Mrs. Whitman would be happy with the results. She planned to spend the evening editing the photos and would have them ready for review within a few days. Driving home through Portland's busy streets, Sarah looked forward to seeing how the images had turned out. She had no idea that when she uploaded those photos to her computer later that evening, her entire understanding of reality would begin to change. The camera had indeed captured something impossible, something that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the world around her. That evening, Sarah sat at her computer with a cup of coffee, ready to begin the editing process. She connected her camera to her laptop and began transferring the files from the Whitman house shoot. The familiar ritual of uploading and organizing photos always relaxed her. She created a new folder labeled Whitman House October and watched as dozens of images populated her screen. Starting with the living room shots, Sarah began her initial review. The photos were technically excellent, with good exposure and sharp focus throughout. The natural light had worked beautifully with the room's vintage character. She moved through the images methodically, rating them and noting which ones would need minor adjustments during editing. When she reached the dining room photos, Sarah paused. In one particular shot of the crystal chandelier, there appeared to be a reflection that didn't make sense. She zoomed in closer, studying the image carefully. In the crystal facets, she could see what looked like a figure standing near the table. But she clearly remembered being alone in that room when she took the photo. Mrs. Whitman had been in the kitchen at that time, preparing tea. Sarah shook her head and moved on to the next image. Photography often created optical illusions, especially when dealing with reflective surfaces and complex lighting. She had learned not to read too much into every shadow or reflection that appeared in her photos. Sometimes the camera captured things the eye missed, or created false images through the interaction of light and glass. The bedroom photos looked beautiful, capturing the vintage furniture and soft window light exactly as she had envisioned. Sarah made notes about color correction and cropping as she reviewed each image. Everything appeared normal until she reached a shot she had taken near the antique vanity table. In the vanity mirror's reflection, there was clearly a person sitting on the edge of the bed. Sarah remembered that area being completely empty when she took the photo. She had specifically checked to make sure no personal items or clutter appeared in the shot. The figure in the reflection was translucent, almost like a double exposure. But Sarah knew she hadn't taken any multiple exposures during the shoot. Her heart began to beat a little faster as she opened the image in her editing software and examined it at full resolution. The figure appeared to be a woman in clothing that looked decades out of style. The dress was dark and formal, with a high neckline that suggested fashion from the early 1900s. The woman's face was partially obscured, but her posture suggested she was looking directly at the camera. Sarah rubbed her eyes and took a sip of coffee. She had been working long hours recently, and fatigue could make anyone see things that weren't really there. Digital cameras sometimes created artifacts or processing errors that could resemble human figures. She had heard of this happening to other photographers, especially when shooting in challenging lighting conditions. Moving on to the study photos, Sarah's confusion deepened. The first few images of the room looked perfectly normal, showing the desk, books, and memorabilia exactly as they had appeared to her naked eye. But in the final shot she had taken, there was unmistakably a man sitting in the leather chair behind the desk. The figure was clearer than the woman in the bedroom mirror. He appeared to be middle-aged, wearing a suit jacket and tie typical of the mid-20th century. His hands were folded on the desk in front of him, and he seemed to be looking directly at the camera with a serious expression. The image was so clear that Sarah could make out details like the pattern of his tie and the way his hair was combed. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. She had been alone in that study, and the chair had definitely been empty when she took the photo. Mrs. Whitman had been outside starting her car at that point. There was no logical explanation for how a person could appear so clearly in a photograph when no one had been there. She downloaded photo analysis software and began examining the metadata for each image. The camera settings, timestamp, and technical information all appeared normal. There were no signs of digital manipulation or file corruption. The images had been captured in RAW format, which made accidental double exposure virtually impossible with her camera model. Sarah called her friend Marcus, a fellow photographer who specialized in wedding and event photography. They often consulted each other about technical problems or unusual situations. When Marcus answered, she could hear music and conversation in the background. "Hey Sarah, what's up? I'm at a gallery opening, but I can talk for a minute." Sarah explained the situation, trying to sound casual despite her growing unease. She described the figures appearing in her photos and asked if Marcus had ever experienced anything similar. There was a long pause before he responded. "That's really weird," Marcus said finally. "I've never had anything like that happen. Are you sure there wasn't someone else in the house? Maybe Mrs. Whitman had family visiting that you didn't notice." Sarah was certain she had been alone with Mrs. Whitman, and that Mrs. Whitman had left before she took the study photos. She thanked Marcus and ended the call, feeling more confused than before. She needed to examine the images more carefully and try to find a rational explanation. Opening her most advanced editing software, Sarah began analyzing each problematic photo pixel by pixel. She looked for signs of digital manipulation, compression artifacts, or camera malfunctions that might explain the appearances. The figures in the photos showed consistent lighting and shadow patterns that matched the rest of the image. They weren't simply pasted in or overlaid on top of the original photos. As she worked, Sarah remembered Mrs. Whitman's parting words about calling if she noticed anything unusual. At the time, the comment had seemed like an odd request from an elderly client. Now it took on a more significant meaning. Mrs. Whitman had seemed to expect that something unusual might appear in the photos. Sarah looked up the Whitman house online, searching for any historical information that might explain what she was seeing. She found records showing that the house had been built in 1892 by a family named Richardson. The Whitmans had purchased it in 1954, and it had remained in their family since then. Public records showed that Eleanor Whitman's husband, Robert, had died in the house 3 years earlier. The house had no recorded history of traumatic events or mysterious occurrences. Sarah found a few old newspaper articles mentioning the Richardson family, but nothing that suggested why she might be seeing figures from different time periods in her photographs. She bookmarked several local history websites to research more thoroughly later. By midnight, Sarah had examined every photo multiple times and found no technical explanation for the figures. The images were genuine, unmanipulated photographs that somehow showed people who had not been physically present when the pictures were taken. She printed out the 3 most clear examples and pinned them to her bulletin board. Looking at the printed photos, Sarah felt a chill run through her apartment. The figures seemed even more real on paper, their expressions and postures suggesting that they were aware of being photographed. The woman in the bedroom mirror appeared to be reaching toward the camera, while the man in the study seemed to be trying to communicate something important. Sarah decided she would call Mrs. Whitman in the morning and ask about the figures in the photos. She had a feeling that Mrs. Whitman knew more about the house's unusual properties than she had initially revealed. As she prepared for bed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her simple photography assignment had opened a door to something far more complex and mysterious than she had ever imagined possible. Sarah woke up early the next morning, with the mysterious photos still fresh in her mind. She had dreamed about the figures, seeing them moving through the Whitman house as if they belonged there. The woman in the vintage dress had been arranging flowers in the dining room, while the man in the study had been writing in a large, leather-bound book. The dreams felt more like memories than imagination. After making coffee, Sarah sat at her computer and examined the photos again in daylight. She hoped that a fresh perspective might reveal some detail she had missed that would explain everything rationally. Instead, the figures appeared even clearer and more detailed than they had the night before. In the morning light streaming through her window, there was no denying that her camera had captured something extraordinary. At 9 o'clock, Sarah called Mrs. Whitman. The elderly woman answered on the second ring, as if she had been waiting by the phone. "Mrs. Whitman, this is Sarah Martinez, the photographer. I've reviewed the photos from yesterday and I need to discuss something unusual with you." There was a long pause before Mrs. Whitman responded. "You saw them, didn't you? The people in the photos who weren't there when you took the pictures." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Mrs. Whitman's matter-of-fact tone confirmed that this was not the first time something like this had happened. "Yes, I did. There's a woman in the bedroom mirror and a man in the study. How did you know? Would you mind coming back to the house this morning? This conversation is better had in person, and there are things I need to show you." Sarah agreed to meet Mrs. Whitman at 10:30. She printed out larger copies of the 3 photos showing the mysterious figures and drove back to the Riverside district. The morning was crisp and clear, with autumn leaves creating a colorful carpet on the quiet streets. The Whitman house looked different in the bright morning light, less mysterious but somehow more substantial, as if it was more present in the world. Mrs. Whitman greeted Sarah at the front door and led her to the living room where they sat across from each other in comfortable armchairs. Sarah spread the photos on the coffee table between them. Mrs. Whitman studied each image carefully, nodding as if she recognized the figures. "The woman in the bedroom is Catherine Richardson," Mrs. Whitman said quietly. "She lived in this house from 1892 until her death in 1924. The man in the study is my husband, Robert. He passed away 3 years ago in that very room." Sarah felt goosebumps rise on her arms. "Are you saying these are ghosts? That my camera somehow photographed spirits?" Mrs. Whitman smiled gently. "I don't know what to call them, but they've been appearing in photographs of this house for decades. Robert first noticed it when he was taking pictures for insurance purposes back in the 1960s. At first, we thought it was a problem with the camera or the film developing process." She stood up and walked to a wooden cabinet against the far wall. From a drawer, she pulled out a manila envelope thick with photographs. Returning to her chair, she spread dozens of photos across the coffee table next to Sarah's digital prints. These were taken over the past 50 years by different people using different cameras, Mrs. Whitman explained. Family members, real estate agents, insurance adjusters, repair contractors. Almost everyone who has photographed the interior of this house has captured images of people who weren't physically present. Sarah examined the older photos with amazement. Black and white pictures from the 1960s showed the same man she had photographed in the study, though he appeared younger. Color photos from the 1980s and 1990s showed Catherine Richardson in various rooms throughout the house. Some images included other figures Sarah hadn't seen in her own photos. Children playing in the hallway, an elderly man reading by the fireplace, a young woman in 1940s clothing arranging books on shelves. "How is this possible?" Sarah asked, her scientific mind struggling to accept what she was seeing. Mrs. Whitman poured tea from a service she had prepared. Robert spent years researching this phenomenon. He was a retired engineer, very logical and methodical. He documented every occurrence, interviewed previous homeowners, and even consulted with university professors who studied paranormal activities. She handed Sarah a thick folder filled with typed notes, newspaper clippings, and genealogical charts. What Robert discovered was that certain locations seemed to hold impressions of the people who lived there. These impressions become visible to cameras under specific conditions, though we never figured out exactly what those conditions are. Sarah flipped through Robert's research, amazed by the thoroughness of his documentation. He had traced the history of every person who had appeared in photographs of the house, confirming their identities through historical records and family documentation. The research spanned decades and included correspondence with paranormal investigators and physics professors. According to Robert's theory, Mrs. Whitman continued, intense emotional connections to a place can leave what he called energetic impressions. These impressions aren't ghosts in the traditional sense, but rather echoes of the past that occasionally become visible to sensitive equipment like cameras. Sarah studied a photograph from 1978 that showed Catherine Richardson standing in the same dining room where Sarah had captured her reflection. The consistency across different time periods and different cameras was undeniable. Why doesn't everyone see these figures? Why only in photographs? Robert believed that cameras can detect light wavelengths and energy patterns that human eyes cannot perceive. Mrs. Whitman explained. Digital cameras seem particularly sensitive to these phenomena, though film cameras captured them too. He documented over 300 instances of photographic anomalies in this house. The scientific explanation helped Sarah process what she was experiencing, though it raised even more questions.
Have you ever seen these figures with your own eyes?
Mrs. Whitman nodded slowly. Occasionally, out of the corner of my eye, I'll catch a glimpse of movement or a shadow that doesn't quite belong. Robert claimed he sometimes felt presences in certain rooms, especially his study. But clear visual sightings are rare. The camera seems to be much more sensitive than human perception. Sarah looked again at the photo of Robert in his study. In the image, he appeared peaceful and content, as if he was simply continuing his daily routine despite being deceased. Do you think they know they're being photographed? That's something Robert wondered about too, Mrs. Whitman replied. Look carefully at the expressions in your photos. Sarah examined her prints more closely. The woman in the bedroom mirror did seem to be looking directly at the camera, and the man in the study appeared to be posing naturally, as if he was aware of being photographed. Their expressions were alert and engaged, not distant or vacant like she might expect from residual energy impressions. Robert theorized that consciousness might persist in some form after death. Attached to places of strong emotional significance, Mrs. Whitman said. The people in these photos all loved this house deeply during their lifetimes. Perhaps part of them chose to remain connected to it. The morning passed quickly as Mrs. Whitman shared more stories about the house's unusual photographic history. She showed Sarah pictures that included multiple figures from different time periods appearing in the same image, as if past and present were somehow overlapping. Some photos showed interactions between the figures, suggesting they were aware of each other across the boundaries of time. As Sarah prepared to leave, Mrs. Whitman made an unexpected request. I was wondering if you might be willing to take more photographs of the house. Robert's research was thorough, but he wasn't a professional photographer. Your technical skills and equipment might capture details that previous cameras missed. Sarah felt both excited and nervous about the possibility. The photographer in her was fascinated by the unique opportunity to document something that challenged conventional understanding of reality. But part of her worried about getting deeper involved in something she didn't fully understand. I'll consider it, Sarah said, gathering up her photos. But I need some time to process all of this first. Mrs. Whitman smiled understandingly. Take all the time you need. The house has been here for over a century, and these phenomena have been occurring for decades. They're not going anywhere. As Sarah drove home, her mind buzzed with questions and possibilities. She had stumbled into something far more significant than a simple photography assignment. Her camera had opened a window into a hidden layer of reality that most people never experienced. The question now was whether she was brave enough to explore that reality further. For the next week, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the Whitman house and the mysterious figures in her photographs. She found herself researching paranormal photography online, reading scientific papers about electromagnetic fields and residual energy, and studying the technical specifications of her camera equipment. Sleep became elusive as her mind raced with questions about what she had witnessed. During this time, Sarah noticed that her regular photography work felt different. When she looked through her camera viewfinder, she found herself scanning for anomalies and unexpected details. While photographing a wedding at a historic venue, she caught herself checking every mirror and reflective surface in her images, searching for figures that shouldn't be there. The experience at the Whitman house had changed how she saw the world through her camera lens. On Friday evening, Sarah made her decision. She called Mrs. Whitman and agreed to return to the house for more extensive photography sessions. They scheduled the first session for the following Monday, and Mrs. Whitman suggested that Sarah bring additional equipment if she wanted to experiment with different techniques. Sarah spent the weekend preparing for what she had started thinking of as a research expedition rather than a simple photo shoot. She borrowed infrared photography equipment from Marcus, researched electromagnetic field detectors online, and even purchased a digital audio recorder in case the phenomena extended beyond the visual realm. If she was going to document something extraordinary, she wanted to approach it as professionally and thoroughly as possible. Monday morning arrived gray and overcast, with a light drizzle that made the autumn leaves stick to Sarah's windshield as she drove to the Whitman house. The weather seemed appropriate for her unusual assignment. creating an atmosphere that felt charged with possibility and mystery. Mrs. Whitman met her at the door with enthusiasm, clearly excited about the prospect of new documentation. She had prepared the house by opening all the curtains and turning on additional lighting to give Sarah maximum flexibility for her photography experiments. I've been thinking about our conversation all week, Mrs. Whitman said as she led Sarah inside. Robert would have been thrilled to know that a professional photographer was taking up his research. He always believed that better equipment and techniques might reveal more details about these phenomena. Sarah set up her equipment in the living room, including her regular camera, the borrowed infrared camera, and several devices for measuring electromagnetic fields and temperature variations. She wanted to approach the session systematically, documenting environmental conditions alongside any visual anomalies she might capture. They decided to start in the study where Robert had appeared in Sarah's previous photos. The room felt different this time, heavier somehow, as if the very air was thick with presence and memory. Sarah began by taking baseline measurements with her environmental equipment, noting the electromagnetic readings and temperature throughout the room. As she prepared her cameras, Sarah felt a sudden temperature drop near the leather chair where Robert had appeared. The electromagnetic field detector began registering fluctuations that didn't correspond to any obvious electrical sources in the room. Mrs. Whitman watched quietly from the doorway, her expression suggesting that she had experienced similar environmental changes before. Sarah began photographing the study methodically, taking shots with both her regular digital camera and the infrared equipment. She worked slowly and deliberately, allowing time between shots to observe any changes in the room's atmosphere. After about 20 minutes, she reviewed the images on her camera's display screen. Robert appeared in 3 different photos, each showing him in a slightly different position at his desk. In one image, he seemed to be writing with an old fountain pen. In another, he was looking up from his work directly at the camera with an expression that suggested recognition. The third photo showed him standing beside the chair, his hand resting on the back as if he was posing for a formal portrait. The infrared camera captured even more remarkable details. Robert's figure appeared with stunning clarity, and the infrared spectrum revealed what looked like energy patterns surrounding him. Swirling luminous patterns danced around his form, creating an aura-like effect that was invisible to regular photography. The energy patterns seemed to pulse and flow, suggesting movement and vitality rather than static impression. "This is incredible," Sarah murmured, showing the images to Mrs. Whitman. "The infrared photography is revealing details that normal cameras can't capture." Mrs. Whitman studied the photos with wonder. Even after decades of living with these phenomena, seeing new evidence still amazed her. Robert theorized that these presences might exist in different light spectrums than normal human vision can detect. "Your infrared camera seems to be confirming that theory." They moved to the bedroom where Sarah had previously captured Catherine Richardson in the vanity mirror. This time, Sarah set up multiple cameras at different angles, hoping to capture Catherine from various perspectives simultaneously. She also positioned the electromagnetic field detector near the vanity table and began monitoring temperature changes throughout the room. The environmental equipment immediately registered activity. Temperature readings fluctuated in a pattern that seemed too regular to be random, and the electromagnetic detector showed consistent energy spikes near the mirror and the area around the bed. Sarah began photographing while calling out descriptions of what the monitoring equipment was detecting. Catherine appeared in multiple photos taken within a span of 10 minutes, but each image showed her engaged in different activities. In one photo, she was sitting at the vanity arranging her hair. Another image captured her standing near the window, looking out at the garden. A third photo showed her lying on the bed, reading what appeared to be a letter. The sequence of images suggested that Catherine was moving through the room and performing activities just as a living person might. The infrared camera revealed the same energy patterns that had surrounded Robert, confirming that both figures generated similar electromagnetic signatures. As the session continued, Sarah began to feel that she was documenting not just random appearances, but genuine interactions with conscious presences. When she moved her camera to different positions, the figures seemed to adjust their poses accordingly. When she spoke aloud while working, describing what she was doing, both Robert and Catherine appeared to turn toward her voice. The most remarkable moment came when Sarah was photographing the dining room. She had set up her cameras to capture the crystal chandelier where she had first seen Catherine's reflection. As she worked, both the electromagnetic detector and temperature monitor registered the strongest readings of the day. Sarah took a series of rapid shots with her digital camera while simultaneously recording with the infrared equipment. When she reviewed the images, she discovered that she had captured not just Catherine, but 3 additional figures she had never seen before. A young man in military uniform stood near the fireplace. An elderly woman sat in one of the dining chairs, and 2 children played near the window. All 5 figures appeared in the same photograph, spanning different time periods based on their clothing and appearance. The military uniform suggested the 1940s, the elderly woman's dress indicated the early 1900s, and the children's clothing looked like 1950s fashion. The image showed multiple generations of people who had lived in and loved the house, all present together in a single moment captured by Sarah's camera. The infrared camera revealed energy patterns connecting all the figures, as if they were part of a larger network of consciousness associated with the house. The patterns flowed between them like streams of light, creating a web of connection that suggested they were aware of and interacting with each other. Mrs. Whitman gasped when she saw the group photograph. "I recognize some of these people from Robert's research," she said excitedly. The military man is James Richardson, Catherine's son who died in World War II. The elderly woman is Margaret Richardson, Catherine's mother-in-law. The children are Bobby and Susan Whitman, Robert's younger siblings who lived here briefly in the 1950s. Sarah realized she had captured something unprecedented. Multiple generations of people connected to the house, all appearing together in a single photograph. The image challenged everything she thought she knew about time, consciousness, and the nature of existence itself. As the day continued, Sarah documented dozens of additional phenomena. She captured orbs of light moving through rooms, energy patterns that seemed to respond to her presence, and figures appearing in locations throughout the house. The infrared camera proved especially valuable, revealing layers of activity that normal photography couldn't detect. By evening, Sarah had filled multiple memory cards with extraordinary images and recorded hours of environmental data. She had documented evidence that suggested consciousness could indeed persist after death, connected to places of deep emotional significance. More importantly, she had gathered proof that these presences were aware, interactive, and part of an ongoing community that transcended normal boundaries of time and mortality. Sarah spent the next 3 days processing and analyzing the massive amount of data she had collected at the Whitman house. Her apartment became a makeshift research laboratory, with photos pinned to every available wall space and multiple computer monitors displaying infrared images, electromagnetic readings, and temperature charts. She had never worked on anything that felt more important or more challenging to her. Understanding of reality. The group photograph showing 5 figures from different time periods became the centerpiece of her analysis. Using advanced photo editing software, Sarah was able to enhance details and examine the energy patterns captured by the infrared camera. The luminous connections between the figures appeared to pulse in synchronized patterns, suggesting some form of communication or shared consciousness that existed beyond normal human perception. On Thursday morning, Sarah received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Michael Chen, a physics professor at Portland State University. Mrs. Whitman had contacted him about Sarah's research, and he expressed intense interest in examining her photographic evidence. Mrs. Whitman mentioned that you've captured some remarkable images that seem to document electromagnetic anomalies, Dr. Chen said during their phone conversation. I've been researching quantum consciousness theories for the past decade, and your work might provide empirical evidence for phenomena that we've only been able to theorize about. Sarah agreed to meet with Dr. Chen that afternoon at his university office. She prepared a comprehensive presentation of her findings, including the environmental data and the progression of images that showed the figures responding to her presence and movements. As she organized her materials, Sarah realized that her accidental discovery at the Whitman house might have implications far beyond a simple photography assignment. Dr. Chen's office was filled with whiteboards, covered in complex equations and stacks of research, papers about quantum mechanics and consciousness studies. He was a tall, energetic man in his 40s who spoke with the enthusiasm of someone passionate about solving the universe's greatest mysteries. When Sarah showed him her photographs and data, his excitement was immediately apparent. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Chen said, studying the infrared images on his computer screen. "The energy patterns you've captured correspond remarkably well with theoretical models of quantum consciousness fields that my research team has been developing. We've hypothesized that consciousness might exist as a quantum field that can persist independently of biological brain function." He pulled up several academic papers on his computer and showed Sarah complex diagrams that bore striking similarities to the energy patterns in her infrared photographs. "According to our models, consciousness fields would be invisible to normal perception, but might be detectable using specialized equipment. Your infrared camera appears to have accidentally provided exactly the type of detection method we've been trying to develop." Dr. Chen proposed a collaborative research project that would combine Sarah's photographic techniques with his team's scientific equipment and theoretical framework. He wanted to conduct controlled experiments at the Whitman House using advanced electromagnetic sensors, quantum field detectors, and high-resolution infrared cameras that could capture data far beyond what Sarah's equipment could achieve. "We could be on the verge of proving that consciousness survives physical death," Dr. Chen explained. "Your photographs suggest that what people call ghosts might actually be quantum consciousness fields that remain attached to locations of strong emotional significance. This could revolutionize our understanding of the nature of human consciousness and the possibility of life after death." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the implications of what Dr. Chen was proposing. Her simple photography assignment had evolved into potential groundbreaking scientific research that could change humanity's understanding of existence itself. The prospect was both thrilling and terrifying. They scheduled the first scientific expedition for the following week. Dr. Chen would bring a team of graduate students and several $1,000s worth of specialized detection equipment. Sarah would continue her photographic documentation while the scientists gathered data that could provide the empirical foundation for an entirely new understanding of consciousness and death. Over the weekend, Sarah returned to the Whitman house to prepare Mrs. Whitman for the upcoming scientific investigation. She found the elderly woman tending to her garden, carefully pruning rose bushes that had been planted decades earlier by previous residents of the house. "I'm both excited and nervous about having university researchers here," Mrs. Whitman admitted as they sat on the back porch overlooking the garden. "Robert would have been thrilled, but I worry about turning our home into a laboratory. These presences have been part of our family for so long, and I want to make sure they're treated with respect rather than just studied like specimens." Sarah understood Mrs. Whitman's concerns. The figures in the photographs had personalities and apparent awareness that made them feel like individuals, rather than scientific phenomena. The idea of subjecting them to intensive analysis felt somewhat invasive, even though the potential benefits to human understanding could be enormous. "Dr. Chen assured me that the research would be conducted with sensitivity," Sarah explained. "He's as interested in the ethical implications as he is in the scientific data. We're not trying to exploit or disturb these presences, but rather to understand them better and possibly prove that consciousness continues after physical death." Mrs. Whitman nodded thoughtfully. "If Robert's spirit is truly present in this house, I think he would want to contribute to expanding human knowledge. He was always passionate about understanding how the universe works. I believe he would approve of this research as long as it's conducted with proper respect." That evening, Sarah experienced something that changed her perspective on the entire situation. While reviewing her latest photos on her computer, she noticed that one image contained what appeared to be text, written in the condensation on a window in the study. The writing was faint but legible, spelling out the words, "Thank you for seeing us." Sarah's hands trembled as she enhanced the image and confirmed that the text was indeed visible in the photograph. Someone or something at the Whitman house was communicating directly with her through her camera. The presences weren't just passive impressions or residual energy. They were actively aware of her work and apparently grateful for her attention. She immediately called Mrs. Whitman to share the discovery. The elderly woman's voice filled with emotion when Sarah described the message. "Robert always believed that the presences in this house wanted to be acknowledged and remembered," Mrs. Whitman said. "Your photography may be giving them a way to prove their continued existence and connect with the living world again." The following Monday, Dr. Chen arrived at the Whitman house with 3 graduate students and a van full of scientific equipment. The team included Lisa Park, a specialist in electromagnetic field analysis; James Rodriguez, who had developed new techniques for measuring quantum field fluctuations; and Amy Thompson, whose research focused on the intersection of consciousness and physics. As they set up their equipment throughout the house, Sarah continued her photographic work, now with the knowledge that the presences were aware of and apparently cooperative with the research. The scientific instruments immediately began registering the same types of anomalies that Sarah's simpler equipment had detected, but with far greater precision and detail. The breakthrough came during the afternoon session in the dining room. Dr. Chen's quantum field detector registered massive fluctuations. At the exact moment Sarah captured the group, photographs showing 5 figures from different time periods. The electromagnetic sensors showed coordinated patterns that suggested the figures were actively generating energy fields rather than simply being passive impressions. The quantum field readings are off the charts, James announced, studying his monitoring equipment. We're detecting organized quantum coherence patterns that are theoretically impossible unless they're being generated by conscious entities. Amy's consciousness detection equipment, which measured brainwave-like patterns in electromagnetic fields, showed coordinated alpha and beta wave patterns emanating from the areas where Sarah's camera had captured the figures. The patterns matched those typically associated with conscious thought and awareness in living humans. "This is absolutely revolutionary," Dr. Chen said, his voice filled with excitement and awe. "We're measuring the actual electromagnetic signatures of conscious entities that exist independently of physical brains. This proves that consciousness is not simply a product of neural activity but can exist as a quantum field phenomenon." The most remarkable discovery came when Lisa's electromagnetic analysis revealed that the energy patterns generated by the various figures were beginning to synchronize with each other and with the research team's own bioelectric fields. The presences in the house appeared to be attempting to establish some form of communication or connection with the living researchers. Sarah captured this interaction photographically, showing streams of energy flowing between the visible figures and invisible fields surrounding each member of the research team. The infrared 6 months after the groundbreaking research at the Whitman House, Sarah found herself standing before an audience of scientists, journalists, and curiosity seekers at the International Conference on Consciousness Studies in San Francisco. The lecture hall was packed beyond capacity, with people sitting in the aisles and standing against the walls. Word of their discoveries had spread throughout the academic community and captured public imagination worldwide. The presentation Sarah was about to give would mark the official announcement of their findings to the global scientific community. Dr. Chen and his research team had spent months analyzing data, conducting peer reviews, and preparing their evidence for publication in multiple prestigious scientific journals. The results had been independently verified by researchers at 3 different universities, and the implications were staggering. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "What started as a simple real estate photography assignment has led to evidence that fundamentally changes our understanding of human consciousness and the nature of existence itself." She clicked to her first slide, showing the original photograph of Robert Whitman sitting in his study. The audience fell silent as she explained how this image had been captured 3 years after Robert's death, using standard digital photography equipment with no special modifications or techniques. The presentation continued with dozens of photographs and scientific measurements that documented the presence of conscious entities existing independently of physical bodies. Sarah showed the progression of evidence, from her initial confused discovery to the systematic documentation that had emerged from months of careful research. Dr. Chen joined her on stage to present the scientific analysis. "The quantum field measurements we've collected provide conclusive evidence that consciousness exists as an electromagnetic phenomenon that can persist after biological death," he explained. "The energy signatures we've documented match theoretical models for quantum consciousness fields that physicists have been developing for decades." The audience reacted with a mixture of amazement, skepticism, and excitement. Questions came rapidly from scientists eager to understand the methodology and implications of the research. How could the findings be replicated? What other locations might harbor similar phenomena? Could this technology be used to communicate with deceased individuals? Sarah fielded questions about the photographic techniques, while Dr. Chen addressed the physics and consciousness theory. Amy Thompson presented data showing that the presences demonstrated memory, personality, and apparent emotional responses to interaction with living researchers. The evidence painted a picture of death not as an ending, but as a transition to a different form of existence. The most emotional moment of the presentation came when Sarah shared the photographs showing multiple generations of people connected to the Whitman house appearing together. The images suggested that family relationships and emotional bonds could transcend physical death, creating communities of consciousness that persisted across decades or even centuries. Mrs. Whitman, now 81 years old, had traveled to San Francisco to attend the presentation. She sat in the front row, watching with pride as Sarah and the research team shared their discoveries with the world. The elderly woman had become something of a celebrity herself, as the guardian of the house that had provided humanity's first conclusive evidence of life after death. Following the presentation, Sarah was interviewed by reporters from around the world. The discovery had implications that extended far beyond science, touching on religion, philosophy, and the fundamental human questions about mortality and meaning. Every major news organization wanted to understand how a freelance photographer had accidentally stumbled upon proof that consciousness survives physical death. "I never intended to become a paranormal researcher," Sarah told a reporter from the BBC. "I was just trying to take good real estate photos, but the camera showed me something that changed not just my understanding of photography, but my entire perspective on life and death." The Whitman house had been designated as a protected research site by the university, with Mrs. Whitman's permission. Teams of scientists from around the world were requesting access to study the phenomena and develop new techniques for consciousness detection. The house had become the most important laboratory for consciousness research on the planet. Sarah's life had transformed completely. She had left her freelance photography business to become the director of photographic research for the university's new Institute for Consciousness Studies. Her techniques were being taught to researchers worldwide, and she was collaborating with teams attempting to locate other sites where similar phenomena might occur. The discoveries had also led to the development of new technologies for detecting and potentially communicating with non-physical consciousness. Companies were investing billions of dollars in research aimed at creating devices that could reliably detect and interact with deceased individuals. The implications for grief counseling, historical research, and human understanding of death were enormous, but perhaps the most significant impact was on individual people grappling with loss and mortality. Sarah received thousands of letters from people around the world who found comfort in the scientific evidence that their deceased loved ones might still exist in some form. The fear of death had been replaced, for many people, with curiosity about what form of existence might await them. Dr. Chen's research had expanded to include multiple locations where consciousness phenomena had been reported. Using Sarah's photographic techniques combined with advanced scientific instruments, they had documented similar findings at historic sites, former hospitals, and family homes across the country. The evidence suggested that consciousness persistence was not unique to the Whitman house, but might be a universal aspect of human existence. The religious and philosophical implications of their discoveries continued to generate debate and discussion worldwide. Some religious leaders embraced the findings as scientific confirmation of spiritual beliefs about life after death. Others worried that reducing consciousness to electromagnetic fields diminished the sacred nature of the soul. Philosophers debated whether the presences represented true continuation of individual identity or simply residual patterns of brain activity. For Sarah, the most meaningful aspect of her discovery was the personal transformation it had brought to her own life. She no longer feared death as an ending, but understood it as a transition to a different form of existence. Her work had shown her that love, memory, and consciousness could transcend physical limitations in ways that science was only beginning to understand. Standing in her new laboratory at the Institute for Consciousness Studies, surrounded by advanced equipment and photographs that documented the impossible, Sarah reflected on the journey that had begun with a simple assignment to photograph an old house. Her camera had captured more than images. It had opened a window into the fundamental nature of human existence and revealed that the boundary between life and death was far more permeable than anyone had imagined. The research continued. with new discoveries emerging regularly as teams of scientists applied Sarah's techniques to locations around the world. Each photograph brought humanity closer to understanding the true nature of consciousness and the magnificent reality that existence extends far beyond the limitations of physical life. What had started as an accident had become the foundation for a new era of human knowledge about the most profound questions of existence, mortality, and the enduring power of human consciousness.